Hegel is well known for his highly technical style of writing, which is often incomparably dense, and as such, it makes it really difficult to parse out, for example, very important differences between terms like notion, idea, and concept. And still to this day, in spite of reading the entirety of the Phenomenology of Spirit amongst other Hegel texts, I still do not really know the difference. And yet, Hegel remains, despite this fundamental confusion surrounding him, an enigmatically enticing figure to me. There's something really impressive about the systematic nature of his philosophy, the breadth of his arguments, his ability to take arguments well beyond what would be assumed to be their final step, and as a result, he's been a really fundamentally important figure in my development as a philosophical thinker. And one of these moments, it's really the first moment of its kind in my philosophical journey I remember, occurred when reading paragraph 346 from the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's in this Miller translation that everyone knows and probably doesn't love. And when I was reading it, it was as if the entire previous 200 pages just kind of came into confluence together at once, like a constellation in which all the stars shimmered at once and made a recognizable pattern. And it was as if the logic of the previous statements regarding the dialectic and spirit and reason and self-consciousness and consciousness all came together at once in a very interesting way. And it represents a profound moment in Hegel's oeuvre in general, because despite Hegel being in many regards a very traditional Christian thinker, he's very Trinitarian in the way that he approaches his philosophy in every regard. And yet at the same time, a little bit of mysticism seeps in here in a very interesting way, which really showcases the promises that Hegel wants to make in his philosophy. The way that this will help us to transcend logic, for example, because Hegel infamously, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, rejects the law of non-contradiction. And I think that's preposterous, of course, and he's got some interesting arguments. I'll probably do another lecture talking about that if you're interested, because it's a very technical, but also very controversial and important aspect of Hegel's work. But he wants us to transcend logic entirely and what he calls picture thinking. And I think this is a very interesting concept to understand in order to grasp the breadth of the concept Geist or spirit in Hegel's work. Now this passage is around a page long, so I'm just going to read the whole thing, and then we'll go back through it piecemeal and try to pick it apart and help you be able to taste the morsels. He says, brain fibers and the like, when regarded as the being of Geist, or spirit, are no more than a merely hypothetical reality existing only in one's head, not the true reality which has an outer existence, and which can be felt and seen. When they exist out there, when they are seen, they are dead objects, and then no longer pass for the being of spirit. But objectivity proper must be an immediate sensuous objectivity, so that in this dead objectivity, for the bone is a dead thing, so far as what is dead is present in the living being itself, spirit is explicitly present as actual. The notion underlying this idea is that reason takes itself to be all thinghood, even purely objective thinghood itself. But it is this only in the notion, or only the notion is the truth of this idea. And the purer the notion itself is, the sillier an idea it becomes when its content is in the form, not of the notion, but of picture thinking. I.e., if the self-suspending judgment is not taken with the consciousness of this its infinitude, but as a fixed proposition, the subject and predicate of which are valid, each on its own account, the self fixed as self, the thing fixed as thing, and yet each is supposed to be the other. Reason, essentially the notion, is directly sundered into itself and its opposite, an antithesis which for that very reason is equally immediately resolved. But when reason is presented as its own self and its opposite, and is held fast in the entirely separate moment of the moments of this asunderedness, the cruder is the appearance of this content, which is either only for consciousness or only ingeniously expressed by it. The depth which spirit brings forth from within, but only as far as its picture-thinking consciousness where it lets it remain, and the ignorance of this consciousness about what it really is saying are the same conjunction of the high and the low which, in the living being, nature naively expresses when it combines the organ of its highest fulfillment, the organ of generation, with the organ of urination. The infinite judgment, qua infinite, would be the fulfillment of life that comprehends itself. The consciousness of the infinite judgment that remains at the level of picture thinking behaves as urination. I know you're like, what did he just say? So much substance going on in there. So let's rewind to the beginning of this passage and pick it apart. So first, he's talking about what Heidegger might call the facticity of the body. This is the material, sort of physical aspects of my body, of the brain fibers and the like. And that when these are regarded as the being of spirit, in other words, the self which can transcend individual moments and take on some objectivity, some sense of existing in an absolute and timeless sense, some sort of, think about when we talk about the human spirit, that can transcend beyond individual generations, can maintain traditions, can maintain attitudes towards the young, towards posterity and whatnot. This is what he's trying to imagine. Some notion of the self which transcends beyond the merely bodily, because of course in the Christian sense, the body is temporary, but the spirit is forever. And one's individual spirit versus spirit as a whole are very different things. Spirit is much more universal than the individual spirit. It's some sort of common human essence that is embodied in, for example, the Heilige Geist, the Holy Spirit, which is Jesus, of course. Jesus is the Word, but he's also different from the Holy Spirit because Jesus is, of course, a man, and the Holy Spirit is this pure essence that connects God to man, connects the transcendent and the sublime to the immanent and the profane of the body. So what Hegel is saying here is that this is merely a hypothetical reality, that I am my body. Because Hegel says, well, the body goes away. And in fact, when I experience myself, I don't experience myself chiefly as a conjunction of atoms. Rather, I conceive of myself as a person, or as an individual, or a being, or a subject, all of which mean more than just the body, even if, for example, those categories implicate the body. As such, this is not the true outer existence of the self. And it's also not the kind of self that is felt and seen in our everyday lives. We don't experience ourselves as if we are a chemical equation, but as if we are an actor, an agent, a recipient, a reciprocator. When they exist out there, when they are seen, they're dead objects and then no longer pass for the being of spirit. In other words, when we try to detach ourselves in this sort of scientific objectification of ourselves, we reduce ourselves to the body and we alienate ourselves from ourselves in so doing. But objectivity proper must be an immediate sensuous objectivity, so that in this dead objectivity, spirit is explicitly present as actual. In other words, what it means to be an acting and living agent. Living is the key word. Think about like the concept of Jesus as the living Word, right? That constantly is creating a connection with us, allowing us to externalize our divine and also human essence. What's going on here is that the notion of objectivity Hegel is looking for is something immediate. For example, when you look at this book, you may be tempted to give a list of physical properties such as, for example, a chemical makeup or a wavelength of light that is the yellow and the orange and the green of this cover. But in fact, that is not the primary way in which you experience the book. You experience it instantaneously and sensuously as something which affects you in a particular manner. And that is the primary phenomenological experience which guides spirit. And in fact, that is what spirit is restricted to. It cannot know the thing in itself, but in fact, it must look inward in a very romantic kind of way. It must look inward and find that spark within oneself. This makes me think of Rilke, for example. He says the notion underlying this idea is that reason takes itself to be all thinghood, even purely objective thinghood itself. But it is this only in the notion, or only the notion is the truth of this idea. And the purer the notion itself is, the sillier an idea it becomes when its content is in the form, not of the notion, but of picture thinking. In other words, when we reduce our knowledge to picture thinking, which is, in a sense, representationalist thinking, bent on logic, reduced to very sanitized concepts, we in fact don't understand the breadth of spirit. We reduce ourselves to historically contingent moments, which Hegel is very aware of historical contingency. So if we want to get beyond that, we have to resist picture thinking and understand that reason, which reason is really the logos of history. It is the driving dynamic motor that allows historical moments to proceed and precede one another and sublate between one another. This self-assunderedness that he talks about, that is the dialectic self-sublating, which is to say, if we have a thesis, an antithesis naturally comes of the self-interior movement, which is reason, within each moment. As a result, he says, if the self-suspending judgment is not taken with the consciousness of its infinitude, right? So consciousness has the ability as a self-suspending judgment, as something which suspends the importance of the self and tries to widen itself to a universal understanding, has the possibility to understand its own infinitude, its ability to go beyond a single finite moment and be a whole which is greater than its parts. This is what can go beyond picture thinking for Hegel. He says that reason, essentially the notion, is directly sundered into itself and its opposite. This is that self-propelling motor, which is reason, that logos, or that rationality or reason or logic by which things move through history. It's something which moves of its own accord. It almost has an élan vital within it. He says, but when reason is presented as its own self and its opposite and is held fast in the entirely separate moment of this assunderedness, it is apprehended irrationally. In other words, if we try to imagine reason alienated from history and not directly embroiled into history, if we imagine moments which stand completely apart and self-isolated and don't directly implicate themselves in one another, we irrationally understand the scope of history, which is to say we don't really understand history at all. We don't understand a coherent narrative which is lived through by individual beings, but rather we just see a tabulated list with no logic connecting it together. And the purer the moments of this assunderedness, the cruder is the appearance of the content which is either only for consciousness or only ingeniously expressed by it. In other words, once again, we create this feeling of alienation by trying to abstract ourselves away from history instead of understanding our relationship to it. The depth which spirit brings forth from within and the ignorance of this consciousness about what it really is saying are the same conjunction of high and low between the generative and the urinative. In other words, we have on our bodies an organ which has the ability to generate new life, and this really, he's talking about the phallus, he's really not talking about the female organs, because the female organs don't produce a fluid which is generative. The male does, but nevertheless, we have the ability to use semen to produce future life, to extend spirit into the universal, to create the social through the multiplicity of human beings. Yet also, this same organ is conjuncted with the capacity for urination, for a more base function, which is getting rid of the bodily refuse inside of us. As such, there is something which, via reason, sheds off the vain, the profane, through the transcendence into future moments. And by doing so, we realize the depth of the living being that is spirit. That's important, the concept of living in its most full extent. As such, the infinite judgment, in other words, the self-conscious being which is able to realize absolute spirit, absolute Geist, qua infinite, would be the fulfillment of life that comprehends itself. True self-consciousness, a ridding oneself of any sense of alienation and a complete transparency of the world and the self in a way in which they congeal into a single mass, which is absolute spirit. Thus, the consciousness of the infinite judgment that remains at the level of picture thinking, that restricts itself to the mere momentary and cannot really understand the implications of history, behaves as urination. In other words, retains the most base functions of the human intellect and is not able to realize its full potential. And this is, of course, a very wild analogy, but hopefully it might give you a taste for what's going on in the phenomenology of spirit. This is, of course, divorced from all the previous 200 pages explaining a lot of the terminology, so it's probably very dense, but maybe it gave you something that might interest you in Hegel. This is one of the most memorable passages of this work, and I like coming back to it every once in a while, seeing how my understanding changes, and doubtless it's not perfect here. But that being said, that's it for this lecture. Consider checking out any of my other ones I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd like to donate to the channel, because I appreciate everyone who decides that they want to help out my endeavors as a future academic, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.